I was born and raised in Chicago in a family that always put business above all else. My father owned a construction company, which gradually grew into a network of firms operating across the country. My mother managed the accounting department, but was essentially my father's right hand. For them, money, connections, and status weren't just important. They were the meaning of life. I grew up accustomed to this, hearing talk of contracts, tenders, and partnerships more often than bedtime stories. At school, I understood that I had things most people didn't: a house, cars, trips. But at the same time, I realized early on that my parents never saw me as an independent person. I was part of their strategy, a pawn that needed to be placed correctly on the chessboard. I had been dating Emily for almost 2 years when it all started. She comes from an ordinary family. Her father worked as a bus driver, and her mother sold clothes in a small store. I never considered this anything shameful. On the contrary, I saw in Emily something that was missing in my world: sincerity, simplicity, the absence of that constant pressure that always hung over me. We met at university in the same psychology lecture, and from then on we were inseparable. She knew my family was rich, but she never looked at me as a wallet. We walked through parks together, ate at cheap eateries, and would sit at her house at night drinking tea with cookies that her mother baked. I enjoyed this more than any dinner at an expensive restaurant, but my parents never liked Emily. My mother pretended to smile when they met, but after each visit I heard phrases like, "She's not our level. She has no ambition. You're wasting your time." My father was more straightforward and once told me to my face that I would have no future with a girl like that. That was the first real argument I had with him, but as usual, the conversation ended in nothing. Everything changed the moment my father entered into a preliminary merger agreement with another company. It was a firm owned by the Hayward family. Their eldest son was practicing law, and their youngest daughter, Catherine, had just graduated from business school. My parents began talking about how a union could be strengthened not only through contracts, but also through family ties. At first, I didn't even believe they were seriously discussing this, but then everything became clear. My mother told me point blank that Catherine was the perfect match for me. She was from a wealthy family, educated, socially adept, and most importantly, her father was willing to invest in my father's new projects. They explained to me that the future of the entire company depended on my consent. I told them I had a girlfriend and that I wasn't going to trade her for some lucrative match. But my words fell on deaf ears. My mother calmly replied that I was still too young to understand responsibility. My father added that there were things in life more important than personal preferences. From then on, the pressure increased every day. I started getting invited to dinner at the Haywards. Catherine turned out to be a pleasant, well-groomed, and well-mannered girl. She knew how to conduct herself in society and clearly knew what was expected of her. I could see that she understood the situation as well as I did. Sometimes I thought she was just as disgusted by it all, but she was playing the part because her family demanded the same. I didn't tell Emily what was happening right away. I tried to cope on my own, thinking it would all resolve itself, but at some point, my father called me into his office and told me bluntly, either I agree to marry Catherine, or he would cut me off from his business and his money. "You'll be nothing without our support." He said these words so calmly, as if he were speaking of something self-evident. I left him feeling crushed. I understood that I had always had a choice. I could leave and live my own life. But at the same time, I had grown up in this world and didn't know what it was like to completely give up everything. When I finally told Emily, she was silent for a long time. Then she said she was ready to be with me even if my parents disowned me. But I saw the anxiety in her eyes. She understood that this wasn't just a conflict with my parents, but a war in which I would have to choose a side. A week later, my mother hosted a dinner where both families gathered. I sat at a long table, next to Catherine, across from my parents, and felt like I was being interrogated. Conversations revolved around business, prospects, and profit. It was as if I were a commodity that needed to be presented properly. At the end of dinner, my father said that Catherine and I looked great together, and that the wedding would be the beginning of a new era for both families. Everyone smiled, but I just sat there, speechless. That evening, I realized the situation was much more serious than it seemed. They had already decided everything for me. I saw Emily less and less. My parents tried to control my every move, and her presence in my life only interfered with their plans. I tried to fight it, but each time I felt my strength draining. The pressure from my family was becoming so great that I began to doubt whether I had the courage to stand up to them. After that dinner, I finally realized I had no choice, at least in my parents' eyes. But I still continued seeing Emily, only now we did it secretly. I stopped driving her home, stopped leaving the car near her house. We met late at night in a small coffee shop on the outskirts, where no one knew us, or simply drove around the city at night in my car, trying not to attract attention. Emily knew it was like a game of hide-and-seek, but she stayed with me anyway. She joked that we were like characters from a cheesy sitcom, forced to hide from the world, but I could see the worry behind her smile. She knew my family wouldn't stop until they got their way. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was only a matter of time, that I'd find a way out, but I increasingly found myself not believing my own words. My parents began to suspect I wasn't following their plan as obediently as they'd like. My mother began asking questions more often, inquiring about where I was spending my evenings, who I was seeing. I answered evasively, talking about work, meetings, and training. But one day, my father told me point-blank that he had people who could verify my every word. I didn't immediately realize how serious this was until one evening at a coffee shop when Emily noticed a man sitting in the corner, watching us a little too closely. She whispered to me, and I noticed too. The stranger pretended to scroll through his phone, but every few minutes his gaze returned to our table. At that moment, a chill ran through me. I realized that my father really could have been watching me. We left the coffee shop and got into the car. I deliberately took the long way, and after a few turns, I noticed the same headlights in the mirror, keeping their distance. I turned sharply into the courtyard of an apartment complex and turned off the lights. The car sped past, and then I was completely convinced that we were being watched. Emily was silent, but her hands were shaking. That night, she said she didn't want to turn her life into constant fear. I begged her to be patient, told her I would figure it out soon, but inside, I didn't know how. A few days later, my mother invited me to a restaurant for a family dinner. I already knew what that meant. The Haywards would be there. And so it happened. My parents, Catherine, and her father were sitting at a large table. They were discussing plans, but I felt like I wasn't even there as a person. To them, I was just part of a deal. I thought about how just yesterday I'd held Emily's hand and promised her everything would be okay. And at that very moment, I'd been sitting next to the girl they were planning to marry me. After dinner, my mother pulled me aside and coldly asked if I was still seeing that girl. I denied it, but her look said she didn't believe me. The next day, Emily called me in tears. Her parents told me that my mother had come to see them. She'd spoken to her mother and hinted that Emily should stay away from me because a relationship like that would never lead to anything good. Her mother was shocked, and Emily felt humiliated. I went to her place right after the call, and we sat on her porch, unsure of what to say. At that moment, I realized my family was ready to go further than I expected. They weren't just keeping an eye on me, they were directly interfering in her life. We agreed to be even more discreet about seeing each other. I even changed my phone number so my parents couldn't monitor my calls. But it didn't help. The real blow was yet to come. One evening, when I arrived at Emily's place, she wasn't home. Her mother said she'd left an hour earlier and was supposed to meet me. I went out in a panic and started calling her, but her phone was disconnected. More than 3 hours passed before she finally called back. Her voice was quiet and shaky. She said 2 men had approached her on her way to my place. They knew her name, knew where she lived, and told her that it would be better for her to stay away from me if she wanted her family to live in peace. I listened and felt my blood run cold. She was crying and saying she was afraid for her parents. I tried to calm her down, but only one thought was running through my head. My parents did this. They sent people to intimidate her. After that, Emily said she couldn't live like this anymore. She loved me, but she wasn't ready to put her loved ones in danger. I begged her not to leave, promised to protect her, but she just shook her head. The next day, I went to my parents' house and started a fight. I screamed that I knew everything, that they had crossed the line. My father listened calmly and said that it was all for the sake of my future. "You'll thank us someday," his words sounded like mockery. I realized that they wouldn't stop. They would destroy any relationship that interfered with their plans. That night, I sat in my room, staring at my phone, and realized that Emily had most likely already decided to leave my life. But I couldn't give up. I decided to fight, even if it meant breaking up with my parents completely. After that night, I realized that the game had become more dangerous than I thought. I no longer doubted that my parents would do anything to make me obey. I was angry, but also afraid. They controlled not only me, but my entire circle. Their connections and money could reach anyone. I tried to stay in touch with Emily, but I felt her withdrawing further and further. Every conversation we had ended with her saying she didn't want her family to suffer. I promised her I'd fix everything, but I didn't know how. A few days later, I received a call from one of my old friends. He worked at a local online publication. His voice was tense, and he said he had something to show me. We met at a bar, and he pulled out his laptop. On the screen was an article that was being prepared for publication. It said that my friend from a poor family was involved in petty theft at a supermarket and even mentioned a story about allegedly skipping school and suspicious connections with certain people. It was all a lie. I knew it all too well, but it all seemed so convincing, with photos, with witness statements, even with database extracts. I was shocked. A friend said the article hadn't come out yet, but the materials had clearly been planted by people with big money. He guessed my family had done it. I felt the ground shift from under my feet. This wasn't just a hint or intimidation anymore. It was a direct attack on Emily. If such an article came out, her life would turn into a nightmare. She would lose her trust, her reputation, her job, and most importantly, her faith in herself. I immediately went to my parents. I burst into my father's office, threw the printout with the text on his desk, and demanded an explanation. My father calmly looked at the papers and said I was being too emotional. "We're just trying to open your eyes to the fact that you can't have a future with people like that," he said, as if he were talking not about a real girl, but about some project. Mom sat next to me and didn't even try to deny it. She said that if I didn't break up with them myself, they would do it in such a way that I wouldn't have a choice. I felt everything inside me boiling. These weren't my parents anymore, but people who were ruining my life and Emily's for the sake of their business. I left the house without another word. I told Emily everything directly. At first, she didn't believe anyone could do such a thing. Then she burst into tears and said she couldn't stand it if her name ended up in the news like that. I tried to calm her down, telling her I had connections and could stop the publication. But she looked at me as if she didn't know if it was worth fighting at all. In the following days, I really tried to stop the article. I talked to the editor, threatened legal action, offered money. A friend helped as much as he could, but the materials kept surfacing, as if someone had arranged for them to be numerous and from different sources. I began to suspect that my father had bribed not only journalists, but also the police and government officials to give these false accusations a veneer of truth. Emily became increasingly withdrawn. She stopped leaving the house and rarely answered her calls. I would go to her place, sit next to her, hold her hand, but I felt her slipping away. One day, her mother quietly told me that perhaps I should let her go if I couldn't protect her. Those words hit harder than any of my father's threats. I began to think that maybe they were right, that I really wasn't capable of protecting her. But at the same time, I understood that if I backed down now, I would become like my parents, a person who sacrifices feelings for profit. I couldn't let that happen. A few days later, I received another call from a journalist friend. He said the publication was scheduled for the following morning. I felt like time was up. I went to Emily and told her that I had to fix everything, that this was my last chance. She looked at me with such weariness in her eyes that I could hardly bear it. She said she didn't believe it was possible to stop my parents, that they had too much power. But I promised I would try until the end. That night, I returned home, and for the first time in my life, I started digging through my father's documents. I knew where he kept the files and where he had access to the computer. I was looking for anything that could be used against him, and I found it. His correspondence with lawyers contained mentions of questionable deals and money transfers to offshore company accounts. I understood that this could become a weapon. If I handed these documents over to the journalists, the scandal would affect not only Emily but our entire family. I sat in the dark with the flash drive in my hands, knowing I had a choice. Either give in and let the life of the girl I loved be destroyed, or take the risk and destroy everything my parents had built. I didn't sleep until morning, and when dawn broke, I realized the decision had already been made. The morning began with the feeling that I was being followed. I left the house with the flash drive in my pocket, deciding to take it to a journalist friend, but in the parking lot I noticed a car I hadn't seen before. Two men were sitting inside, pretending to read a newspaper. I could feel their eyes even through the window. When I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, they followed. My heart was pounding as if I were running a marathon. I made a few extra laps around the block, and there was no doubt left. The surveillance was real. It could be my father's people. I made a sharp turn toward the mall, parked, and blended into the crowd. I hid the flash drive in my sock because I didn't even trust my own pockets anymore. Inside, I sat on a bench and pretended to scroll through my phone, but I kept thinking about how my parents knew. Perhaps they'd already discovered I'd been going through their documents. My thoughts raced through my head. I realized I was playing with fire, and this fire belonged not to someone else but to my own family. That evening, my father called me into his office. His office always seemed cold, but at that moment it felt like a cage. He sat at his desk, my mother standing next to him, and they both looked at me as if I were a traitor. On the desk lay an empty folder which had held the documents I'd copied just yesterday. "You think we won't notice?" My father's voice was calm, but every intonation grated on my nerves. My mother added that if I crossed the line again, I would regret it. I tried to hold on, telling them I wasn't going to be their puppet, that they had crossed all boundaries by threatening Emily and her family. But my father didn't even blink. He said my feelings were weakness, and that weakness needed to be eradicated. When I tried to leave, he said something that made me stop. "You don't understand that it was she who was put in danger, not us." Those words sounded like a death sentence. I ran out of the office with a feeling they were planning something. 2 days later, what I feared most happened. Emily called me hysterically. An anonymous letter had arrived at her university accusing her of fraud, along with forged checks and receipts. She said she had been summoned to an investigation. I rushed to her and saw such horror in her eyes that I was ready to kill whoever was behind it. She was shaking and saying that it was all over now, that her parents had gotten their way. I tried to hug her, but she pushed me away. "You don't understand. They'll make a criminal out of me if you don't stop." Her words sounded like both a plea and an accusation. I realized that my parents had decided to destroy her reputation completely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room, listening to every sound. One question lingered in my head: how far were they willing to go? The answer came faster than I thought. The next morning, an unknown number called me. A male voice said he knew about the flash drive and that I'd better bring it to a designated location, otherwise the consequences would be irreversible. I tried to stall for time, but the voice immediately warned. "If you don't, someone will get hurt." I realized the threat was real. I drove to the parking lot of an old warehouse, where the same 2 men from the car were waiting for me. They looked calm, even polite, but their eyes said that politeness would end if I tried to play. One held out his hand and said, "The flash drive." I held it in my pocket and felt my palms sweat. I knew that if I handed it over, I would have no more cards, but if I didn't, I would risk Emily's life. Everything inside me was torn apart. I said that the flash drive was somewhere else and that I hadn't taken it. The men exchanged glances and one stepped closer. His voice was quiet, but there was a chill in it. "Don't play the hero. Heroes don't live long." In that moment, I realized that my father was ready to go beyond intimidation. He was ready to destroy anyone who interfered with his plan, even his own son. I only got out of there alive because I promised to hand over the flash drive within 24 hours. When I returned home, my mother was waiting for me in the living room. She said that they knew everything and that my father was disappointed in me. Her words were like an icy knife. She didn't yell or accuse. She simply spoke as if stating a fact. "You chose someone else's girl over your family. You've lost everything." I felt like the walls of the house weren't mine anymore. They were the territory of enemies who knew everything about me and could break me at any moment. That evening, I called Emily and told her I had to meet her. I didn't tell her about meeting with my father's people. I just said that we needed to act. She came to the park. We sat on a bench in silence. Finally, I confessed that I had evidence against my father and that it was because of that evidence that they had acted so harshly. Emily looked at me with horror and asked why I did it. I said for us to stop them. She grabbed my hand and whispered, "They will kill you." Those words echoed in my head. I knew she was right, but I also knew that if I gave in now, I would lose her forever. When we parted, I firmly decided that I would not give up the flash drive. I would find a way to use it. But deep down, I knew that now they would hunt not only me, but her as well. I kept the flash drive with me at all times, as if it were the only anchor keeping me from falling into the abyss. But with each passing day, I watched Emily get worse. She stopped smiling, stopped laughing at my jokes, which used to always save her from sadness. Now she hardly left the house and constantly checked her phone, as if expecting another blow. I knew that my parents would not stop until they got their way, but I hoped that I could protect her at least with my presence. One evening, when I arrived at her place, her mother opened the door. There was something strange, anxious in her gaze. She said that Emily was in her room and asked me to come up. I walked in and saw her sitting on the bed with a suitcase. My heart sank. She looked up slowly, as if she were about to confess to a crime. And what I heard was worse than any blow. She said she was leaving. Not from me, but for me and for her family. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. She said she could no longer live in constant fear, that she didn't want her parents to worry every night that something would happen to her. She knew my parents wouldn't stop until they forced her out of my life, and she decided to do it herself. I tried to interrupt, begged her to stop, told her that we could handle it together, that I had found evidence against them. But she only shook her head. Her eyes were red from tears, but there was a determination in them I had never seen before. "I love you, but I can't be the reason you go to war with them." Those words tore me apart from the inside. I felt like I was losing her right then and there, and no words would help. I grabbed the suitcase, tried to push it aside, telling her I wouldn't let her go, but she pushed my hands away and said her decision was made. She hugged me tighter than ever and whispered, "I'm sorry." I stood there, unable to move, as she walked past me to the door. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, the slam of the front door, and only then did I realize it was over. That night, I wandered the city aimlessly. The car was left outside her house, and I simply walked the streets, numb. Everything I had done for her, all my plans, the incriminating evidence, the flash drive, it all lost meaning without her by my side. But deep down, I knew it wasn't her decision. It was one forced upon her by fear. My parents had achieved their goal. They had destroyed us without a direct order, without a scandal. They had simply pressured her until she broke. I came home that morning to find my parents having breakfast. They were acting like nothing had happened. My mother asked if I'd stayed out late the night before, and my father was pouring himself coffee. I looked at them and realized they knew. They knew Emily was gone, and that's why they sat there so calmly, as if they'd won a game of chess. I wanted to throw the flash drive in their faces, to scream that I hated them, but instead I just stood there and said nothing. Words weren't enough to express everything I felt. In the following days, I tried to find Emily. Her phone was disconnected. The university said she was taking a leave of absence, and her parents kept saying only one thing: "Leave her alone." I knew she'd done it for them, to protect them from my parents, and that's why she was hiding even from me. I felt dead inside. But the worst part was, my parents thought they'd won. My father increasingly spoke of his upcoming engagement to Catherine, and my mother hinted that time would put everything in its place. They acted as if they had erased Emily from my life forever, but I couldn't accept it. Every day, I took out the flash drive and looked at it as if it held the answer. I knew I could use it to destroy my parents, but now it wasn't just for myself. It was for Emily, to prove that their methods weren't based on force, but on cowardice and meanness. Sometimes I thought I was going crazy. I heard her voice in my head, her laughter, her words. I imagined her somewhere nearby, just hiding, waiting for safety. But the longer she was gone, the more the emptiness grew. And with the emptiness, determination. My parents thought they'd removed her from my life forever. But I decided that if I couldn't bring her back, I could at least destroy their world, built on lies and fear. I didn't yet know how, but I understood that this war was just beginning, and now I was ready to fight to the end. I began to notice that my parents' pressure was going beyond all bounds. Their methods were no longer limited to persuasion, hints, and blackmail. Now it was open warfare. One morning, two men in formal suits knocked on my door. They introduced themselves as investigators and showed me documents. I didn't immediately understand what was happening, but very quickly I realized it was another trap. They took me to the station and showed me security footage of a man dressed similar to me allegedly stealing things from a warehouse. My face was hidden in the footage, but my name was on the documents. I tried to explain that I was somewhere else that evening, but no one paid any attention to my words. They recorded them in the report as a subjective justification. It was as if the world had unanimously decided to find me guilty. I left there feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. That was just the first blow. The next day, my bank accounts were frozen. I was told it was due to an internal review. Several work contracts were canceled. Partners wrote short messages. "Sorry, we can't continue working together." Fear was evident in every word. I knew it wasn't their decision. They were under pressure. I tried calling the journalist who had previously promised to help me, but his number was unavailable. I later learned he'd been told to stay away from my story or he'd get into trouble. Rumors began to swarm me. False stories about me allegedly running scams appeared on social media. People forwarded me links to posts calling me a fraudster. Someone even posted a doctored video of me acting aggressively and threatening others. I watched in disbelief. Every frame was a lie, yet it looked convincing. My reputation was crumbling before my eyes. Friends began to distance themselves. Some stopped answering their calls. Others wrote that they were better off not communicating with me for now. I understood their fear, but it hit harder than any blow. When trust breaks, a person is left alone. The hardest thing was that my parents did all this in cold blood. I saw them at a family dinner. They sat calmly, reserved, talking about business and upcoming deals. Not a single hint that they were involved in my bullying. But I knew it was their job. Their hands reached everywhere. The police, the courts, the media, the banks. My every move was monitored. The turning point was the situation with Emily. I went to her house to at least see her. A group of people stood outside with signs. They were covered in false accusations. They were shouting that she was involved in fraud. Journalists with cameras were filming everything as if they were seeing a real criminal. Her mother looked devastated. She didn't understand where all this came from. Emily didn't even open the door. I realized that my parents had moved on. They didn't just want to separate us. They wanted to erase her name, destroy her reputation. I stood by and watched her life fall apart, feeling helpless. I tried to contact the editors. They refused to publish, citing a lack of evidence or saying they couldn't take the risk. Some even hinted that they had big clients. I realized that my parents had closed all channels. Even the lawyers I hired said the fight would be too long and too expensive. At that moment, I realized I was being backed into a corner. I saw people leaving my life, one by one. Each one disappeared under pressure or threats. I was left alone, and my parents continued to press. A lawsuit was filed against me for allegedly assaulting a security guard. Witnesses were found who confirmed that they saw me there. Among them was a childhood friend. He wouldn't look me in the eye. When I tried to talk, he said only one thing: I was threatened. And I realized that now there was no one who would dare to stand up for me. At the trial, the prosecutor presented false documents and photographs. The judge placed restrictions on me. I was not allowed to go anywhere near Emily's university or her home. This news hit me the hardest. Now I couldn't even meet her by chance. I felt that my parents had achieved their goal. They had taken away my freedom, my reputation, and the opportunity to be near her. But deep down, I knew that giving up was impossible. I started collecting little things. Car license plates, strangers' faces, phrases heard in the courtroom corridors. I wrote everything down. I felt like there was a weak link somewhere. I didn't know how long it would take or whether I would be able to prove anything. But there was no other way. I knew that if I stopped, they would erase me completely. I was alone, but I still had the truth. And this truth was now my only weapon. For a long time, I thought that I could endure everything, that I could collect evidence, wait for the right moment, play their game. But at some point, I realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. My parents were guiding me step by step toward accepting their rules, to appear in public alongside Catherine, smiling and playing the role of the perfect heir. I watched them prepare the ground for the big meeting with the Haywards. The house was filled with an air of anticipation about the deal, and every conversation ended with the idea that this union would solve all problems and strengthen the family's future. They spoke these words as if they weren't talking about my life, but about a new office or a bargain. Anger was building inside me. I remembered Emily's face, her tears, her suitcase on the bed, her words about leaving for me. I saw my parents calmly having breakfast after depriving me of happiness, and how my father delighted in telling his partners about the upcoming alliance. I wanted to scream right in their faces, but I held back. I thought I needed to act smart. But when the day of the general meeting arrived, I realized I couldn't keep it inside any longer. The house was full of people. A large table was set in the living room. My father looked pleased. He greeted the guests personally, laughing and joking. My mother was in perfect shape, holding Catherine's arm and introducing her as the future bride. Catherine was smiling, but I saw something strange in her eyes, as if she herself couldn't quite believe what was happening. I sat among the guests and felt the blood pounding in my temples. The wine in front of me seemed bitter. The words around me sounded muffled, as if I were sitting underwater. My father raised a toast. He spoke of union, of the future, of two respected family names uniting. People applauded. My mother looked at me with a smile, waiting for me to rise and speak. But instead, I felt something burst from my chest that I could no longer contain. I stood up and said that this marriage was a lie. All eyes turned to me. The guests froze, their glasses hovering in the air. I said that I had no intention of marrying Catherine, that this whole production was a dirty deal where I was being traded like a commodity. I said I loved someone else and that my parents had done everything they could to destroy this relationship. I spoke loudly so that I could hear my voice even through the silence that hung in the room. My father stood up abruptly. His face turned pale. He said I didn't know what I was talking about and asked me to sit down. But I didn't. I continued. I explained that I knew about the machinations, that I had seen their schemes, that I understood why they needed this union. I said that their entire game was built on fear and lies. People exchanged glances. Some looked as if they didn't know where to look. My mother turned pale, her smile disappeared. She quietly tried to stop me, but I could no longer remain silent. I looked at Catherine and saw that she was confused. She clearly hadn't expected this. Perhaps she even felt a sense of relief inside, but she didn't dare say anything out loud. My father came closer and said almost in a whisper that if I didn't stop now, he would make sure I had nowhere to return to. But this only added fuel to the fire. I loudly declared that their plans no longer concerned me and that they could forget about me as a son. A deathly silence fell over the room. The Haywards looked indignant. Their leader had said that such behavior was unacceptable and that they would not participate in family affairs where there was discord. His words sounded like a sentence. My father clenched his fists. He was barely restraining himself from losing his temper right in front of the guests. My mother held his hand, trying to restrain him. One by one, the guests began to rise and leave. The entire carefully constructed scene collapsed in a matter of minutes. I stood in the center of the room and felt an emptiness inside. I had achieved what I wanted. I had spoken the truth and thwarted their plans. But at the same time, I understood that now the price would be higher than ever. When the guests left, my father approached me. His face was stony. He said that I had crossed the line. His voice was quiet, but there was a threat in it. My mother remained silent. Her eyes were cold, without a drop of maternal warmth. Catherine stood to the side. She looked at me with a strange expression, as if two feelings were warring within her, fear and relief. I left the house and realized there was no turning back. I had ruined their plans. I had challenged them head-on. But now they would not stop. Now they would take revenge. I knew that even greater pressure lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had done something right. I was no longer silent. I was no longer playing by their rules. I woke up the day after the scandal with the feeling that the world had changed completely. The house was unusually quiet. Not my mother's voice, not my father's footsteps, not the usual bustle of the servants. It was as if the walls had absorbed the tension and were now keeping silent themselves. I understood that a conversation lay ahead on which much depended, but I didn't know what form it would take. A strange calm filled me. I had said everything I had kept inside. I had thwarted their carefully laid plans, and now I had to pay the price. The only question was, what price? My father showed up at breakfast. His face was stony, his gaze heavy. He didn't shout or make a scene. He simply sat across from me and looked at me for a long time. His gaze was both tired and furious. Then he said I had let the family down, that I had ruined the reputation he had worked hard to build his entire life, that now half the partners would hesitate before doing business with us. His words were like blows, but I no longer hid from them. I replied that I had no intention of being a commodity and that my life was not their project. He listened silently. My mother came in a little later. She looked different than usual, not stern and collected, but somehow tired. She didn't look me in the eye. She only said that they hadn't intended to destroy my happiness, that everything was done for the future. I laughed, bitterly and loudly. I said that if their future was built on my misfortune, then I wanted nothing to do with it. At that moment, my father slammed his fist on the table. For the first time in a long time, he lost his temper. But instead of threats and orders, he said something unexpected. He admitted that he couldn't force me, that he had power, money, connections, but no power over my choices. And if I wanted to live my own life, I had to be prepared for the fact that they would no longer protect me. His voice was harsh, but there was a certain restrained honesty in it. It wasn't reconciliation, but it wasn't war either. It was a breakup wrapped in cold form. I knew I had achieved my goal, but there was no joy. Instead of relief, emptiness fell upon me. I had lost my family as I knew it. I watched my father rise from the table and leave without so much as a glance at me. My mother lingered longer. She came over and quietly said that she still hoped I would someday understand them. I replied that perhaps someday they would understand me. It was a moment when we both knew the road back was closed. The next days passed in strange silence. No one brought up the topic of marriage. Catherine disappeared from our circle as quickly as she had appeared. Rumors of a scandal circulated, but my parents hushed it up as always. They could do that. To the outside world, they were still a powerful couple with an impeccable reputation. Only within the family, a rift now gaped. I tried to contact Emily, but her number was disconnected. I learned from friends that she had gone to stay with relatives in another state. Perhaps she wanted nothing more to do with me or my family. I didn't blame her. She had been through too much. I would go out in the evenings and walk aimlessly just to feel like I could move on my own, that my steps were no longer controlled by anyone. This feeling of freedom was new and frightening. I realized that I had lost everything: support, money, the life I had become accustomed to. But at the same time, I had gained something important: the right to choose for myself. A week later, my father spoke to me again. His tone was formal, almost businesslike. He said that from now on I had to be responsible for myself. I would no longer receive a single cent, not a single connection. He spoke as if he were signing a contract. I nodded. It hurt, but deep down I knew this was exactly what I wanted. Freedom rarely comes without a price. My mother tried to soften his words. She said that the doors of the house would always remain open, but I saw in her eyes that this was more of a formality. There would be no real return. I left, this time for good. I rented a small apartment and took a simple job to cover my expenses. Every day was hard. I was no longer an heir. I became an ordinary person who had to earn my own living. But every time I came home and closed the door behind me, I felt something that hadn't been there before. I belonged to myself. Sometimes I caught myself missing my mother, my father, our home. But then I remembered the cold looks and manipulations. I understood that our connection was not completely broken, but changed forever. We were no longer a family in the old sense of the word. We became people related by blood, but divided by choice. The ending of this story was not how I imagined it. I did not find complete happiness. I did not bring Emily back. I did not defeat my parents. But I won something else: the right to be myself. In a world where everyone was used to being controlled, for the first time I took a step independently. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was the beginning of a new, difficult, but honest life. And at that moment, I realized that this was exactly what I'd always been missing.